in 1991, southern Iraq. Dawn was just breaking across the flat. Lifeless expanse of desert outside Basra. A column of Iraqi T-72 tanks, proud Soviet exports, advanced with calm precision. Their crews had been assured by Soviet advisors that they held the advantage. The American Abrams, they were told, was heavy, gas-hungry, and too complex for war. If they met it in combat, they would overwhelm it. That morning, they would learn just how wrong that was. Without warning, the tank at the rear of the column erupted into flames. Then the one beside it vanished in a blast of smoke and fire. Radio chatter spiked. The Iraqi commander's voice cracked through the net. Incoming fire, identify source. But no one could... There were no helicopters, no planes, no vehicles within visual range. Nothing. Another explosion, and another. Panic spread. The Iraqi tankers swung their turrets wildly, scanning for targets they couldn't see. The desert stretched out around them empty. A phantom war was unfolding, and they were its victims. 3 kilometers away, hidden behind a slight rise, sat a platoon of M1 Abrams tanks, their crews calm, their thermal sights locked. They were in no rush. Each shot was placed with the cold precision of a machine executing code. At that distance, the T-72s couldn't even return fire. Their optics couldn't find the Abrams. Their rounds, even if they fired blind, wouldn't reach... It wasn't a battle. It was a live fire exercise. For the Americans, it was the moment their tank proved everything it was designed to be. For the Iraqis, it was the moment the myth of Soviet armor died. Over radio intercepts, I saw one Iraqi officer could be heard shouting, "Where are they? We can't see them." A U.S. tank commander later recalled, "We weren't fighting them. We were erasing them." That morning, in less than 15 minutes, an entire Iraqi armored unit was destroyed. It would not be the last. What began as an invisible ambush would soon become a global military reckoning because halfway across the world, in Soviet command centers and military academies, stunned generals watched footage of their prized T-72s burning in the desert and asked a question no one could answer. How could the Americans kill from so far away and never be seen for nearly 2 decades? Soviet tank doctrine had rested on a foundation of cold calculus and hard numbers. The T-72 wasn't a superweapon. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be enough cheap, reliable, easy to mass produce, and good enough to overwhelm the West through sheer volume. It had a low profile, a decent gun, and most importantly, could be built in the thousands, inside the classrooms of Soviet armored academies. Western tanks like the American M60 and its successor, the M1 Abrams, were analyzed and dismissed. Soviet instructors insisted the Abrams was too heavy to maneuver effectively, too reliant on complex electronics, and too expensive to field in serious numbers. "It looks impressive," one instructor told his students, "but it's a logistical fantasy." And the Iraqi officers trained in these schools listened. They memorized range charts, studied frontal arc penetration diagrams, and practiced the rhythms of Soviet battle drills. They were told that NATO armor was built for show, not for war. The real battlefield, they were assured, would be won by numbers, tactics, and resilience. But none of those assumptions survived contact with the desert. From the very beginning of Operation Desert Storm, the American approach to armored warfare didn't just surprise Soviet-trained officers. It upended everything they thought they knew about tank combat. Iraqi units, still clinging to line formations and frontal assaults, found themselves shredded before they could return fire. The Abrams wasn't just heavier. It was faster. It wasn't just electronic. It was coordinated. And it didn't just survive enemy hits, it avoided them entirely. In one Soviet war college, a retired general reportedly watched CNN footage of a burning tank column and asked, why didn't they retreat? Didn't they see what was happening? They hadn't, because by the time an Iraqi tank commander knew he was under fire, it was already over. What Soviet doctrine had failed to grasp was not just a technical gap, but a philosophical one. The Abrams wasn't designed to trade fire. It was designed to never be touched, to strike from beyond the edge of enemy vision. And that one difference range made every Soviet assumption obsolete. When the smoke cleared over the battlefield, it wasn't just tanks that were destroyed. It was belief. Soviet armored doctrine was forged in the blood and mud of the Second World War. Blitzkrieg had taught them the value of speed. Kursk had shown them the cost of underestimating defensive depth. But by the 1980s, that doctrine had crystallized into something dangerously rigid. Tanks were to operate in mass formations, overwhelming enemy lines through shock and attrition. Precision was irrelevant. Range was a luxury. Fire control, a Western indulgence. That doctrine was about to shatter. The T-72 was the embodiment of that thinking. It was compact, with an autoloader to reduce crew size and simplify logistics. Its 125mm gun was formidable on paper, but its fire control system was primitive by NATO standards. Lacking thermal sights and stabilized targeting, its armor, once state-of-the-art, was now increasingly vulnerable to modern kinetic penetrators. But in Soviet war games, none of that mattered. What mattered was numbers, mobility, simplicity. Enter the Abrams. The American M1 was everything the T-72 wasn't. It had a high-powered, 120mm smoothbore gun. It carried advanced thermal imaging, laser rangefinders, and stabilized fire control systems. It was powered by a gas turbine engine that sounded like a jet. To the Soviets, it was overkill. To U.S. crews, it was a revolution. And in the deserts of Iraq, it became clear that the U.S. hadn't just built a better tank. They had rewritten the rules. Iraqi tank units, trained in Soviet maneuver warfare, rolled into battle expecting frontal exchanges. But before they could form up, their tanks began erupting in flames. Engagements didn't last minutes, they lasted seconds. U.S. tank commanders didn't find the enemy. They already had him marked from miles away. Thermal optics pierced the night. Data links coordinated fire across entire battalions. GPS provided exact positioning, while Iraqi units stumbled forward using compasses and voice radio. Abrams crews moved in synchronized formations, feeding targeting data across vehicles with clinical speed. The T-72 didn't just lose a firefight, it lost its place in modern war. For Soviet planners, the implications were catastrophic. Their doctrine depended on parity, on the belief that their equipment was close enough to NATO's. That belief had held for decades. But now, from the burning sands of Kuwait to the command bunkers of Moscow, one truth was sinking in fast. The West hadn't built an equivalent force. They had built an asymmetric one. And the Soviet model, with its glorified mass and outdated assumptions, had just been exposed as obsolete. February 26, 1991. A date seared into the minds of every Iraqi tanker who lived through it, if they lived at all. That morning, the 2nd Brigade of the U.S. 1st Armored Division engaged the elite Tawakalna Division of the Republican Guard, just west of the Kuwait border. It wasn't a skirmish. It wasn't even a battle in the traditional sense. It was an annihilation. The terrain was flat, open, perfect for long-range engagements. The Iraqi T-72s deployed in defensive formations, dug in and facing south, expecting a frontal assault. But the Abrams didn't oblige. It circled, It climbed low ridge lines. It watched silently through thermal sights. Then it struck. At over 3,000 meters, nearly 2 miles, Abrams gunners began firing. One by one, the T-72s lit up. Their reactive armor, meant to defeat shaped charges, meant nothing against the kinetic rods of the M829 Sabot rounds. The penetrators punched through the frontal glacis and turret rings like a fist through paper. In seconds, the Soviet-built tanks began erupting in fireballs. Ammunition cooked off, turrets launched skyward, and the Iraqis never saw their attackers. What made it worse was that, from their perspective, there was no engagement. Their optics couldn't detect targets at that distance, let alone track them. By the time any vehicle commander spotted the Abrams muzzle flash, his tank was already a coffin. 2 Iraqi officers. This wasn't war, it was sorcery. In post-battle analysis, U.S. units reported kill ratios that stunned even their own commanders. At Medina Ridge alone, 186 Iraqi tanks were destroyed. The U.S. had lost 4, not 40, 4, and none to direct tank fire. Most were from mines, fratricide, or mechanical failure. This was the moment the impossible became reality. A tank was not supposed to dominate at long range. Soviet doctrine had never accounted for it. The T-72's gun could hit targets at distance on a firing range, but its real-world effectiveness dropped sharply after 1,800 meters. At 3,000 meters, it might as well have been throwing rocks, but the M1A1 had changed the equation. It could see farther, move faster, fire more accurately, and survive hits that would kill anything else on the field. Iraqi crews, trained to advance under covering fire, were now disoriented, retreating, or simply abandoning their vehicles. Several were found with hatches open, their crews nowhere in sight. The Abrams wasn't just killing tanks. It was shattering morale. And half a world away, when Soviet tank officers reviewed the engagement logs and satellite imagery, they realized something terrifying. If the United States could do this to one of their best-equipped client divisions, they could do it to anyone. When early intelligence reports arrived in Moscow describing the destruction of the Iraqi Republican Guard's armored units, Soviet analysts dismissed them as exaggerations, Western propaganda at best, and psychological warfare at worst. Kill ratios of 40-1 tank duels ended before the Iraqis even saw the enemy. Entire battalions routed in minutes impossible. One general scoffed. No system can do that, not against prepared Soviet equipment. But denial couldn't hold for long. As more satellite imagery came in, as radio intercepts from frantic Iraqi officers were replayed, as video footage from U.S. tanks captured in real time on embedded cameras was broadcast on global news networks, the disbelief began to buckle. The Soviet Union had equipped Iraq with nearly 4,500 tanks, many of them T-72s or upgraded T-55s and T-62s. These were the same models forming the backbone of Warsaw Pact armored forces. These were the tanks trained to push through the Fulda Gap in West Germany, to spearhead a Third World War. Now, they were being destroyed in droves by an enemy that barely seemed to break formation. In closed briefings, senior Soviet defense officials demanded answers. How did they close the distance undetected? They didn't. A junior analyst replied, they engaged from beyond Iraqi range. Moscow's internal reviews turned panicked. Some reports were buried, others were rewritten. One KGB memo noted, if these results are accurate, the T-72 cannot be considered survivable on a modern battlefield. What was even more humiliating was that the Americans weren't even trying to hide it. Pentagon press conferences openly showcased footage of Abrams kills. The U.S. military was flexing because they could, and Soviet planners, who once believed their tanks were good enough, now saw just how wide the gap had become. In training facilities from Kazan to Chelyabinsk, instructors began rephrasing their lectures. Soviet armor was no longer superior by design, it was now effective under certain conditions. The Abrams, once mocked as a Western luxury item, was now studied with grim fascination. How had the Americans done it? The answer, whispered in officer corridors and circulated in hastily classified reports, boiled down to one reality. The Americans hadn't just built a tank, they had built a system, and that system interlocking optics, fire control, armor, and speed had rendered Soviet armored warfare theory a relic of the past for years. The prevailing theory inside Soviet armored circles had been simple: victory would come through mass, speed, and discipline. If Western tanks were more advanced, they would be outnumbered. If they were heavier, they would be slower. If they were expensive, they would be fewer. Soviet planners saw tank warfare as a numbers game, and the T-72 was their trump card: cheap to build, easy to maintain, and rugged enough for frontline duty. That theory was about to collapse. In theory, a T-72 could engage targets up to 2,000 meters away. In theory, its 125mm smoothbore gun could penetrate Western armor. In theory, with effective coordination and numerical superiority, it could crush NATO formations. But Desert Storm revealed that this theory failed in every category that mattered. T-72s couldn't see the Abrams, couldn't track it, and couldn't hit it before they were killed. In most engagements, Iraqi tank crews died without ever knowing where the enemy was. In some cases, U.S. tanks fired the first shot before their adversaries had even powered on their turrets. That wasn't a tactical problem, it was a foundational flaw. And yet, even as the data poured in, many Soviet theorists clung to the old logic. The Iraqis didn't use the T-72 correctly. They claimed their crews were undertrained, their deployment was flawed. In Soviet hands, the results would be different. But deeper analysis eroded that defense. American tankers were moving faster, reacting quicker, and coordinating with air power in ways Soviet doctrine simply didn't allow. The Abrams wasn't just a better machine, it operated in a different conceptual space. A battlefield where information was weaponized, where seconds mattered more than steel, and where distance was the ultimate shield. In this world, the T-72's biggest strength, its simplicity, became its greatest liability. And the longer the Soviets stared at the outcomes of the Gulf War, the clearer it became. Their theory of armored warfare wasn't just flawed, it was obsolete, built for a battlefield that no longer existed. They had been preparing for a war of attrition, but the Americans had already moved on. They were fighting a war of precision, and the T-72, for all its numbers and legacy, was nothing more than a moving target. If the first theory to collapse was about equipment parity, the second was about battlefield survivability specifically, the myth of armor invincibility. Soviet engineers had long assumed that with enough frontal armor and clever design, a tank could survive the first few hits and keep fighting. They called it boyevaya zhivuchest, combat survivability. But what happened in Iraq turned that confidence into ashes. The T-72 was supposed to survive direct hits. Its designers had banked on composite armor, explosive reactive tiles, and sloped plates in test ranges. It could withstand older NATO rounds and RPGs. But the battlefield was no test range. American Sabat rounds, the M829 series, were traveling at over 1,500 meters per second, and their depleted uranium cores didn't just penetrate, they liquefied steel and crew alike. What truly horrified Soviet analysts wasn't that T-72s were being destroyed. It was how they were being destroyed. Turrets weren't just cracking, they were launching skyward in flaming arcs. Autoloaders turned into internal shrapnel machines. Ammunition stowed below the crew compartment cooked off in chain reactions. Some tanks were incinerated in under 3 seconds. Others disintegrated so completely. There was no body recovery, just blackened hulls and scattered tracklings. And Abrams tanks. They took hits and kept rolling. In one documented case, an M1 was struck by a 125mm shell and 2 RPGs in a single engagement. It sustained minor damage, no casualties, and remained combat operational. Another Abrams survived a mine blast, then returned to the front after field repairs, all within hours. The American approach to survivability had inverted the Soviet model, where the T-72 emphasized speed and low silhouette to avoid hits. The Abrams was built to take them. Its turret was crew-isolated. Its ammo was stored in blowout compartments. Its layered armor was tailored to absorb and deflect modern penetrators. This didn't just affect casualties. It affected morale. U.S. tank crews went into battle knowing their machine could save their lives. Iraqi and Soviet crews went in knowing their armor was a metal coffin. That psychological gap between confidence and terror turned every engagement into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in Soviet-designed bureaus, engineers began to panic. For decades, they had mocked the Abrams' weight, its turbine engine, its cost, but now those very features were proving decisive. Survivability wasn't just a bonus, it was the reason U.S. crews fought longer, fired faster, and returned alive. The second wrong theory, the belief that armor alone could save the tank, was dead, because the Abrams hadn't just outgunned the T-72. It had outlived it. At the height of the Cold War, Soviet intelligence prided itself on technical infiltration. Their operatives stole NATO manuals, reverse-engineered Western missiles, and eavesdropped on U.S. war games. By the 1980s, they believed they had a clear picture of American armor doctrine, slow, cumbersome, and overly reliant on support infrastructure. So when the Abrams rolled onto the Kuwaiti battlefield in 1991 and decimated Soviet-made armor with speed, precision, and impunity, the Kremlin's intelligence services were blindsided. How had they missed this part of the failure lay in assumptions. Soviet analysts viewed U.S. tank development through the lens of Soviet priorities. They believed American tanks were designed to fight like Soviet ones line up. Close in, exchange fire. They had heard of advanced fire control systems and thermal sights, but dismissed them as marginal advantages, gimmicks that wouldn't hold up in real combat. They were wrong. What intelligence hadn't accounted for was how all those gimmicks fused into a system. Real-time battlefield management, thermal optics, laser rangefinding, stabilized turrets, and satellite positioning weren't just accessories, they were multipliers. When Abrams crews entered battle, they weren't alone. They were networked into a web of reconnaissance drones, AWACS surveillance, and air support. Soviet intercepts of U.S. logistics focused on fuel issues, turbine engine quirks, and spare part complexity. These were highlighted in KGB reports as vulnerabilities, but they completely missed how U.S. logistics had been built around those needs and how that infrastructure allowed Abrams units to operate far forward, deep into enemy territory. Then came the greatest intelligence oversight of all crew training. Soviet doctrine emphasized short, intense training cycles with rigid procedures. American doctrine emphasized initiative. Abrams gunners could identify, acquire, and fire on a target in under 5 seconds at night, in sandstorms, and on the move. Soviet analysts had no metrics for that. They had no modeling for a tank crew that could adapt mid-battle without a radioed command from HQ. The result, a catastrophic mismatch between expectation and reality. Soviet command had prepared for a slugging match between two armored masses. What they got was a surgical dismemberment by a faster, smarter, more lethal machine, and the intelligence services, caught between outdated analysis and political pressure to maintain illusions of parity, found themselves unable to explain how it had happened. One GRU colonel reportedly remarked, "We studied their steel. We should have studied their minds, because the Abrams wasn't just built better, it was used better." And that gap in doctrine, in training, in design was something no stolen blueprint could close. The M1 Abrams wasn't just a tank. It was the tip of a spear forged from decades of experimentation, failure, and adaptation, one that shattered every Soviet assumption about how war would be fought in the 21st century. At first glance, the Abrams seemed like an odd choice for the used army. It was huge, heavy, and fuel-hungry. Soviet engineers joked that it was a rolling gas station. But in the deserts of Iraq, those criticisms evaporated because what mattered wasn't what the tank consumed. It was what it delivered. The American system didn't start at the Abrams. It started with the doctrine that guided it. This was air-land battle, a revolutionary concept born from the lessons of Vietnam, the Israeli-Arab wars, and NATO's vulnerability in Europe. Rather than relying on massed armor formations, air-land battle envisioned a fast-moving, integrated force that could destroy an enemy before it reached the front. It emphasized mobility, deep strikes, and overwhelming coordination between ground and air assets. The Abrams was built for this doctrine. Its turbine engine wasn't a liability, it was a weapon. It gave the tank unmatched acceleration, allowing it to reposition, flank, and exploit faster than any comparable platform. Its thermal sights weren't for show, they let it see through smoke, dust, and darkness. Its fire control system, capable of calculating a perfect shot while moving at full speed, turned every engagement into a one-sided duel. But what made the Abrams deadly wasn't the tank itself, it was the team around it. U.S. tank crews were the best trained in the world. They drilled relentlessly, firing leave rounds under combat conditions, using computer simulators to refine reflexes. Gunners could track and destroy a moving target at 2,500 meters, while in motion before their Soviet counterparts had even locked in a range. Behind the frontline tanks came layers of support artillery, delivering GPS-guided shells, air cover from A-10 Warthogs and F-16s, drones feeding real-time video, and logistics convoys operating with near-flawless precision. Every Abrams crew knew they weren't alone. They were part of a system where every piece knew its role. Contrast that with the T-72, an isolated vehicle, deployed in rigid formations, with limited night vision, slower response time, and little battlefield flexibility. Soviet doctrine assumed the tank would fight alone or with others just like it. The U.S. system assumed the tank was one cell in a living, evolving organism. This was the true American system, not just better hardware, but a synchronized ecosystem of speed, vision, command, and lethality. When the Abrams fired, it wasn't just a shell, it was the endpoint of satellites, signals, and seamless logistics. And the Soviets, watching their tanks erupt in fireballs from 3,000 meters away, finally understood. They weren't being defeated by a machine. They were being outmaneuvered by a military that had redefined the battlefield itself. The Battle of 73 Easting wasn't just a skirmish, it was a reckoning. A clash so lopsided, so brutally efficient, that even Soviet hardliners could no longer pretend their tanks could compete. February 26, 1991, a U.S. cavalry unit, Eagle Troop of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, was advancing through a sandstorm toward the Iraqi Republican Guard. Visibility was poor. Conditions were brutal. But the Abrams didn't need clear skies. It didn't even need daylight. Its thermal sights locked onto heat, not color. And when Eagle Troop stumbled across an entire battalion of Iraqi tanks, they didn't panic. They opened fire. From over 2,500 meters away, the M1A1s began destroying T-72s before the Iraqis even knew they were being watched. Shell after shell struck with pinpoint accuracy. Within 23 minutes, 28 Iraqi tanks were burning. The Americans suffered 0 losses. This wasn't war, it was demolition. And it didn't stop there. Throughout the Gulf War, M1 Abrams tanks engaged and obliterated Iraqi T-72s, Soviet exports, and knockoffs with clinical precision. In every engagement, the Abrams hit first, hit farther, and survived strikes that would have killed any Soviet design. For Soviet commanders watching through intelligence intercepts and CNN footage, the humiliation was unbearable. Their prized design, the T-72, a tank, deployed to more than 30 countries, was being turned into battlefield wreckage. The core of their armored doctrine was unraveling in real time. And most damning of all, the Iraqi crews were fighting as trained. These weren't amateurs. They were Soviet-advised, Soviet-equipped, Soviet-trained. And they were dying in minutes. Reports filtered back to Moscow. One engagement, 18 Iraqi tanks destroyed before they fired a shot. Another, a single Abrams, shrugged off multiple 125mm hits and kept fighting. Crews were surviving ambushes, driving through fire, reloading while moving, and coordinating kills with uncanny speed. The Soviet response, silence. Because to acknowledge the scale of the defeat meant acknowledging the failure of an entire system, engineering, doctrine, intelligence, command. Some tried to spin it. The Iraqis weren't disciplined. Others said they lacked air cover. But behind closed doors, generals knew the truth. If Soviet armor couldn't survive in open desert, it stood no chance in the forests of Europe. The humiliation wasn't just visual, it was existential. The Abrams hadn't just won a battle. It had shattered the myth of parity. It had taken the pride of the Soviet tank force, the T-72, and exposed it as obsolete, vulnerable, and outclassed. What followed wasn't just a retreat from doctrine. It was a collapse in confidence. And in Moscow, the humiliation echoed like a distant gunshot, one that marked the end of the Soviet armored era. The Soviet Union had always believed in quantity over complexity. Tanks were symbols of strength, and industrial might was measured in the number of armored divisions rolling across the steppes. For decades, the T-series tanks, T-54s, T-62s, T-72s formed the backbone of this belief. Simple, rugged, easy to produce. That was the doctrine. But after the Gulf War, that doctrine lay in ruins. The defeat of Soviet-designed armor wasn't just about metal on metal. It was strategic. It was ideological. It cut to the heart of the Soviet military identity. The Abrams didn't just survive hits. It erased entire formations before they could respond. This was more than technological superiority. It was a revolution in how the West viewed war. And for Soviet command, it exposed a terrifying realization. Their entire system training, engineering, doctrine was built for a battlefield that no longer existed. Soviet planners had assumed the next war would resemble World War II massed tank armies clashing head-on. But America had built a machine for a different war, a war of sensors, precision, and synchronization. The Abrams was only part of the equation. Behind every kill was satellite surveillance. Behind every move was real-time GPS coordination. Behind every platoon was seamless logistics. The American system didn't just fight it anticipated, and that broke the Soviet model completely. In classified sessions, generals argued over responses. Some demanded upgrades, others wanted to copy American designs. But it was already too late. By the time the Gulf War ended, the Soviet Union itself was cracking. In the waning days of 1991, the empire that had once poured billions into tank divisions simply ceased to exist. The irony was brutal. One of the last great humiliations of the Soviet military was not delivered by a nuclear strike, nor a NATO invasion, but by an American tank that cost twice as much, weighed twice as much, and proved to be worth every pound. In the ruins of Soviet ideology, only one truth remained. The future didn't belong to the tank that could be built the fastest. It belonged to the one that could see the farthest, shoot the fastest, and never be touched. And the M1 Abrams had proven, beyond any doubt, that vision, precision, and doctrine could destroy an empire's illusions, one burning T-72 at a time. Today, decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the M1 Abrams still roams the battlefield, and the T-72 still haunts it. In countless flashpoints from Iraq to Ukraine, the same old tanks reappear, painted in new colors, crewed by new soldiers, but fighting battles rooted in Cold War assumptions. And each time they meet, the results echo the ghosts of 1991. In Iraq, Abrams tanks faced T-72s again in urban warfare, the outcome the same. In Ukraine, Russian-built T-72s burned in drone footage, sometimes taken out by weapons far older than themselves, again and again. The same principle reasserted itself: visibility, speed, and command not just armor win wars, and yet in military museums from Warsaw to Vladivostok, Soviet tank designers still honor the T-72 like a mythic beast, a war machine that was meant to sweep across Europe. But the myth was broken in 1991 when U.S. tank crews men, barely out of their 20s, outgunned elite Soviet-built forces under blinding desert sun. They weren't fighting just tanks. They were fighting ideas. Ideas like armor is enough, that numbers will overwhelm, that simplicity wins wars. Those ideas died in burning columns across southern Iraq. They died under the crosshairs of American gunners who could fire on the move, see through smoke, and strike before the enemy even knew they were there. The Abrams didn't just rewrite armored warfare, it buried a Cold War illusion. And as new wars threatened to repeat old mistakes, the ghost of that battlefield still lingers, whispering to any strategist who dares ignore it. Build for the future, not for the past. Or watch your army burn before it ever fires a shot.